People make the assumption that just because Toph is direct and blunt, that she is not complex. But much like my other two favorite characters, Zuko and Uncle Arrow, Toph is one of the most complex, complicated, and contradictory characters in Avatar: The Last Airbender. In how she views gender, in how she views her independence, and in how she views her blindness, Toph, like so many great characters, holds two opposite positions at once, without ever seeming like they actually contradict each other. For example, we know that the number one thing she hates is people thinking that she's weak because she's blind. But while a character like that in a different show might use this to say, "I'll never let anyone view me as weak ever again," Toph, several times in The Last Airbender, actually exploits this false perception that people have of her and uses her blindness to take advantage of them. Not just Toph, but the show does this too, exploiting our biases to make us look foolish. Let's start there. In fact, let's start where it all begins. Book 2, Chapter 6, The Blind Bandit. We find ourselves in a slightly shady fighting arena where Team Avatar is searching for an earthbending teacher for Aang. We're first shown the stereotypes that fit our expectations of what a mighty earthbender might look like. Burly, hulking men hurling rocks at each other, and while Sokka is instantly enamored with the Boulder, a fan favorite, Aang is not convinced that this is the right guy, or any guy here for that matter. As an audience, our expectations are being set up that as the Boulder beats fighter after fighter, something big must be coming at the end, literally. Someone, we assume, who must be even tougher and beefier than him. Then the lights dim as the announcer says, "And now the moment you've all been waiting for, the Boulder versus your champion, the Blind Bandit." And we see the camera start from this angle above the championship belt and slowly move down to perspective coming from below a mysterious figure. A low shot like this is usually used to make a person look bigger as they loom imposingly over the camera. And that's what's happening right now with Toph. By the way, when we're closely analyzing a scene like this, we may have to use freeze frames and filters, but please don't be mad. This is just what we need to do to dodge BS copyright flags so that the video can actually stay public for you to watch, so please bear with. Everything up to this moment has been building to make her seem as big as possible, both physically and metaphorically. And then, in a perfect metaphor, the darkness fades and we see reality for what it is. The camera widens and we see in the center of our screen teeny tiny Toph. This shot makes Toph look genuinely so cute that it makes me go, "Aww," every time, and that's very much intentional from the show. Firstly, look at these two ladies here. Now right from the jump, you can say that this is a satire of boxing, where you'll have the ring girls performing this same duty, usually while strutting around in tight clothes. Normally they're an indicator of the male gaze, indirectly telling everyone that this is an event assumed to be watched by men and for men. But in this context, well, they don't serve that purpose at all. They're stood next to a small girl after all. But again, this and this entire scene is all about playing with, subverting, and criticizing our expectations. Because these slender, weak-looking ladies actually look huge compared to our champion fighter in the ring. I mean, Toph is like less than half their size, and compared to them, she looks like a toddler, and everything else around her is adding to that image as well. First, look at the belt. Remember that this is something that ordinarily a wrestler would be able to wear around their waist, but this thing is about the same size as Toph and twice as big as her head. It looks like it should be a struggle for her to even hold it up. And then there's this cape she's wearing, which is clearly oversized with like half of it dragging along the floor, and look how big it gets when the lady takes it off of her. But all of this is the point. We know that the human mind is built to make instant judgments off of just one glimpse at something. The things on screen may change and go away rapidly, but this image is meant to stick with us and set up our expectations. The show here is doing, as we'll explore in this video, what Toph sometimes does herself, playing into an image that relies on our misguided preconceptions. Of course, presumably, you've seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, and so we both know that all of this is wrong. Toph is going to kick the Boulder's butt with ease, and the butt of just about everyone else she faces throughout the entire show. She is the greatest earthbender who ever lived, and yet we're introduced to her in this way that's meant to make her seem weak and frail and like she needs protection. That's certainly how Sokka sees it when he says, "She's going down." And even Katara questions, she can't really be blind, it's just part of her character, right? Because everyone, us included, is wrong for letting their first image and biases be the judge of someone. And like Toph, the show is telling us here that sometimes being able to see doesn't mean you actually get a better picture of what's going on. Your eyes can deceive you. This is just one of the many beautiful facets of Toph. So let's dive a little bit deeper on the inventor of metalbending, the champion of the ring, the blind bandit herself, Toph Beifong. Now, what we just discussed in the intro was how the lens of the show creates certain expectations about Toph and then uses that against us. But Toph also does this herself. While she does resent people viewing her as weak and helpless because of her blindness, something we'll talk about, she also isn't against using it to her advantage. When the gang meet her at the Beifong home, she gets annoyed with them and wants them gone. And in order to achieve that, she pulls out the Damsel in Distress Act and calls the guards, telling them about how she heard something and she was scared. Then in Book 3, Chapter 7, when Team Avatar in the Fire Nation, she plays into this stereotype again of being a helpless blind girl in order to lull the street scammers into a false sense of security before in turn scamming them. Me, I'm just a simple blind girl, she pretends, before getting up to her trademark mischief. Toph, as we know, explicitly hates when people see her as weak and vulnerable because of her blindness. It's the defining struggle that she first enters the show with, verbally expressing how much she hates how her parents see her as this fragile little thing. It's sort of her core reason for running away from home to join Team Avatar. And in the episode after she joins the team, she fights with Katara about not doing her fair share because she simply wants to look after herself and leave it at that. She feels the gang's attempts at communal living is actually them trying to look after or mollycoddle her because of her perceived weakness. It's only after a deep chat with Uncle Iroh that she realizes that seeking help from people she cares about is not weakness, but an act of love. I talk about this scene more in my video essay on Uncle Iroh. And yet Toph, if nothing else, is a realist. She may hate that this is how some people view her, but she knows that it's inevitable that they'll do it. She's willing to exploit this image for her own gain sometimes, because that's the world she knows she physically has to live in. Understanding this duality that exists within Toph, and really all of us to some extent, is what we need to understand the character as a whole. It is what makes her so fascinating to analyze, both who she is within the show, but also what she represents as a fictional character is characterized by this complexity. Now before we go deeper into the video, I feel I need to put a little disclaimer. Firstly, I am not a disabled person, and I'm not a woman. We'll be talking about both issues in this video, as they are very important to understanding Toph. But I want to be clear that my perspective is not one that comes from lived experience. What I'll say is definitely the perspective of someone from the outside looking in, and so if there are nuances I miss, then I apologize in advance and please do feel free to correct me in the comments. But also, I didn't want to just wade into this discussion willy-nilly. And so for the last couple weeks, I've been reading as much literature as I can around people's perspectives on Toph, especially from women commenting on her femininity and disabled people talking about her blindness. One of the best works I found on the topic was actually a whole book called Avatar: The Last Airbender and Philosophy, which is a series of academic articles analyzing various different parts of The Last Airbender. In it, there's a very interesting piece called The Rocky Terrain of Disability Gain in Avatar: The Last Airbender. Is Toph a super crip stereotype or a disability pride icon by Joseph A. Stramondo? This question, if Toph is a super crip stereotype or a disability pride icon, is another one of those dualities that we need to discuss. The term super crip refers to the story trope of a disabled person essentially performing extraordinary feats that prove somehow that they can overcome their disability to essentially become normal in some sort of heroic way. As someone from a racial minority, this is an idea I do understand. It's this instinct that a lot of people have that even if there is systemic bias against you, you can overcome it by being twice as good and working twice as hard as a normal person. Now, super crip stories are not exclusive to fiction. Real-world athletes, for example, can often fall into these archetypes. But if we want an example from fiction, then think of Matt Murdock from Daredevil. After losing his sight at a young age, Murdock has his other senses enhanced to such a superhuman level that he becomes a crime-fighting vigilante. But the problem with super crip stories is that, as writer Shaylee Coran puts it, they can act as a defense mechanism for the status quo. Because if one mad or disabled person could beat the odds and live happily in our current society, ostensibly, all mad and disabled people should have it within themselves to do the same. Essentially, the idea of the super crip makes it so that a disabled person not living an extraordinary life must be, by comparison, down to a moral or individual failing, i.e. their fault. So where does Toph fit into that? Well, Stramundo concludes in their article that Toph is not a supercrip and instead fits into a different archetype, that of the proud disabled person. The PDP narrative has three major components, and Stramundo argues that Toph fits into all three. 1. It portrays disability as sometimes a gain rather than as pure tragedy. 2. It portrays disabled characters as fully developed and nuanced rather than relying on stereotype. And 3. It involves disabled characters as central drivers of a plot and not merely present to teach a moral lesson to non-disabled characters. To that first point about seeing disability as a gain, let's elaborate a little more. This isn't talked about in the article, but if you think about the construction of the world of The Last Airbender, it's interesting that most of Toph's disadvantages in the show come from constructions of people, not inherently from her blindness. If you look at the time she's most uncomfortable, it's either A, around her parents and how they treat her, B, in metal vehicles like the submarine they use for the Day of the Black Sun or Azula's giant drill that she refuses to go in, C, various prisons she gets put in that have no earth, and D, when flying on Appa. Of these, only the last is not the result of human creation. In a natural setting, Toph is no less equipped to face the world than anyone else. It's also interesting that in The Last Airbender, you can consider bending to be like a sixth sense, though one that not everyone has. So where ordinarily you may say that someone with blindness is lacking in one sense, Toph has access to another one that allows her to navigate the world in her own way. In a similar way that someone would use Braille to read instead of sight to overcome their inability to read a book, Toph uses earthbending to picture the world instead of her eyes. So while there are times when she may be at a loss for not being able to see, it's also sometimes a huge gain, allowing her to see the world in a way that literally no one else can. Then we'll skip to point 3, that disabled characters should be drivers of the plot, and this is also something that Toph fits. She may have joined the team to teach Aang earthbending, but that's not all she does. She is an active participant in all the decisions, combat, and emotional journeys that the characters go through. And now let's go back to point 2, about disabled characters being nuanced. This is something we will be exploring for basically the rest of the video. Because ultimately, the thing about Toph, and I'll be emphasizing this a lot, is that she's not just the product of one thing. And to reduce her to that would be disrespectful or just missing the point. She's not simply blind, she's not simply a girl, she's not simply a rich kid, and she's not even simply an earthbender. She's all of these things. So let's talk about one of the most important parts of those, the thing that she seems to struggle with the most, her familial baggage. As I've already mentioned, one of the early struggles that Toph overcomes after her introduction into the show is of learning to rely on others and not feel like that means people are belittling her. But this isn't just a personality trait that came out of nowhere. Like so much of Toph's behavior that we'll analyze, it's pretty obvious where it came from. We're shown pretty clearly that her parents view Toph as helpless and delicate. In fact, at one point her father explicitly says, "My daughter is blind. She's blind and tiny and helpless and fragile." This, of course, is why he believes she can't fight and shouldn't be learning any advanced forms of earthbending, because he views her as fundamentally weak. This is why Toph enters the show with that chip on her shoulder, that she feels like anytime someone tries to help her, they do so out of a feeling that she can't help herself, because that's how her parents treated her. But it also creates other baggage, namely in her desperation to rebel. It's not just that Toph rejects the way her family treats her, she rejects everything about the way she was raised. After spending a lifetime dolled up and pruned and presented as a perfect picture, she spends her travels being unbothered about things like a morning routine or being perceived as well put together. She hates upper class society and resents all the time the gang spend in Ba Sing Se, a city which bothers her more than any of the other characters. That's partly because I think she sees through the facade of the whole place a lot more quickly than everyone else, but also because she associates it with her family. Fancy visits to the upper crust where being babysat by a handler and invited to lavish balls was her normal life. And it's also why Toph is so anti-authority. She spent her life being told exactly what to do and how, and now she resents it thoroughly, which is why she has that clash with Katara in Book 3, Chapter 7, The Runaway, when Toph gets herself a bounty on her head for running scams and Katara is unhappy about it. It's in fact during this confrontation that Katara essentially pegs Toph's psychology for what it is. Toph tells her that she should appreciate how good they have it. They get to travel around the world having fun and making easy money with no parents to tell us what to do. That's when Katara hits her with an uncountable truth bomb, telling her that she acts this way because of her parents. They were controlling over you and so you ran away, and now you act like your parents don't exist. You act like you hate them, but you don't. You just feel guilty. To which Toph replies, I do hate them. It's understandable that Toph would feel and behave this way after a lifetime spent essentially being suppressed, having her personality and even existence clamped down. Remember that the Beifongs don't tell the outside world about their daughter. When Aang is asking around trying to find the blind bandit, the kids who he questions tell him that he might be looking for the Beifong family, but that they don't have a daughter. No doubt Toph is aware of this fact, and that's got to be deeply hurtful to a child. In that runaway episode, she confesses that despite her disagreements with Katara, Katara loves me, the real me. That's more than I can say about my own mom. She also cries when she thinks about how hurt her parents must have been when she ran away. So the trauma is really clearly on display. And if you listen closely to what she says in the show, you realize that her running away with the Avatar wasn't the only time she's tried to escape that household trauma. Famously, of course, we know that Toph ran away as a kid and hid in a cave, which is when she was found by the badger moles and learned earthbending from them. But when they're on Ember Island, there's this scene which is supposed to be played off as comedic, but I actually find deeply tragic for two reasons. When the gang split up to find Aang, who has disappeared just before the final fight, Toph clings to Zuko and says she wants to go with him, which surprises everyone else. She simply replies, "What? Everyone else had a life-changing field trip with Zuko, now it's my turn." Later, we cut to them mid-conversation as Toph says, "And then when I was 9, I ran away again. I know I shouldn't complain. My parents gave me everything I ever asked for, but they never gave me the one thing that I really wanted, their love." We're meant to find this funny as the audience, and there's even exaggeratedly sad violins playing in the background to undercut what's about to come next, because Zuko, in his Zuko way, brushes Toph off by saying, "Look, I know you had a rough childhood, but we should really focus on finding Aang." And Toph meekly replies, "This is the worst field trip ever." Honestly, I'm inclined to agree with her. The first reason this is sad is because Toph is confiding in Zuko because he too obviously has a complicated family history, and she feels like he would understand her in a way that the others can't. Aang was raised by monks, and Katara and Sokka had a loving family. So Zuko's the only one who would understand the pain of what distant parents can do to you. But this brings me to the second reason I find this tragic, because listening to her speak, I feel like Toph has an even worse familial history than Zuko. Which is crazy to say, I know. In my defense, at least Zuko had a loving mother who raised him for 10 years, and a loving uncle who has doted on him since. Toph, as she's clearly expressing, has never felt the love of a parent. In fact, her time with Team Avatar is the first time in her life she's ever felt love at all. If Toph feels crude or distant when she's first introduced, it's understandable because when she's confessing to the truth of her bending to her parents, she says a line that's truly heartbreaking. She says, "I'm 12 years old and I've never had a real friend." If anything, it's a credit to Toph that she's able to learn and grow in a relatively short space of time and come to the point where she can give and receive love as well as she does. If there's one criticism I have of the show, and believe me, I don't say that lightly about Avatar: The Last Airbender, is that this is one piece of trauma they don't resolve for the main characters. If you look at the rest of Team Avatar, by the end of the show, they resolve their greatest pain points. Aang is finally able to fulfill his duties as the Avatar and banish the guilt of his disappearance 100 years ago. Katara is able to resolve her feelings about her mother's death with Zuko's help. Sokka becomes a capable warrior and an inspirational leader. Zuko is able to find himself, redeem his honor, and the honor of the Fire Nation. But what about Toph? The thing that troubles her the most, her relationship with her family, is never resolved. She sends them a letter at the end of Book 3, Chapter 7, but we don't know what's in that letter and we don't know the results of it. Even just a small scene would have been enough at the end of the show of Toph's parents finding her in that celebration speech that Zuko gives and them telling her that they're proud of her. Or maybe back at Ba Sing Se at Iroh's tea shop. After all, if they've had doubts over their daughter's capabilities, she's just saved the goddamn world. Doesn't that deserve some acknowledgement from them? Now I know that there are later comics released that address some of this situation, but as I mentioned in my previous video, I want to analyze a piece of media for what it is, not for what got added retrospectively. This is an analysis of Avatar: The Last Airbender, after all. It took several years after the show finished airing for any comics to release, and years more before Legend of Korra released, in which Toph does make more appearances, but again, is not The Last Airbender. ATLA is its own piece of media with plenty of episodes, and Toph deserved a conclusion to her story within it. So coming back to her family, we can now incorporate our two sections together, creating a fuller picture of that intersectionality of Toph that we mentioned. It's clear that the primary source of the Beifong family's shame of Toph comes from her blindness. At least, that's the best guess we can make. Whenever her father talks about Toph's fragility, he tends to reference her blindness as the main factor. Again, if you think about that line he says when Katara and Sokka ask for Toph's help in fighting, he says, "My daughter is blind. She is blind and tiny and helpless and fragile." He feels the need to repeat the word blind twice, indicating just how much it's on his mind. And as we've established, this shame and distance that Toph's family felt from her is the thing that bothers her the most. But considering that, it's actually quite incredible that she is as proud and badass as she is. This is the kind of trauma that might burden someone to the point of debilitation. I mean, look at how much Zuko struggles with his family history in the show. But it's a testament to Toph's singular personality that she is still so proud and defiant and self-assured. It definitely goes back to the idea of the proud disabled person and not allowing how others view her to define her. And in this context, you can even see Toph's bending as an act of defiance. By being as good as she is, by being the greatest earthbender in history, Toph is a living middle finger to both her parents and the assumptions people make about her capability because of her blindness. Now again, there's a danger of turning Toph into that super crib stereotype, a disabled person who is there merely as a source of inspiration for non-disabled people and their self-actualization. But clearly, this is not the case here. Toph is amazing in her own right, and she clearly doesn't view her disability as something that makes her inferior in any way. She defines so many of the significant moments in the show, pulling off feats that literally only she could do, including the invention of metalbending. The way she does it too, I think, feeds into this idea, because having learned from the badger moles, the way Toph bends is different to how anyone else does it. She doesn't bend to overcome her disability, she bends as a way of understanding the world, and that gives her an alternative view of looking at things that others simply don't have. That's why when Toph describes how she learned from the badger moles, she says, "I was able to learn earthbending not just as a martial art, but as an extension of my senses." For them, the original benders, it wasn't just about fighting, it was their way of interacting with the world. For basically everyone else in the world of Avatar, bending is a physical act, akin to a martial art that stands separately from their everyday lives. But for Toph, bending is her everyday life, in the same way that it is for the badger moles. And you could argue that this is an incredible metaphor for disability. In the same way that blindness doesn't make someone inherently lesser, Toph doesn't use bending to compensate for her blindness. What it means is that she experiences the world differently, and different just results in different outcomes. That is why Toph is the only person who's able to invent metalbending, because no one else views the world like she does. It shows the value of diversity, I think. In an age where people attack and question the value of diversity and representation and inclusion, it's amazing that this cartoon from the early 2000s shows us a perfect metaphor for how someone having an alternative view of the world can result in amazing outcomes that otherwise would never have been possible. As much as the things that unite us make us strong, it is also our differences that make us grow. Now before we go further in this video, I have one humble request of you. If you're still here, then that means you've enjoyed this content so far, or are very dedicated to hate watching. So I hope you'll listen to this next part. I really need your support in being able to create more content like this. Videos like these take weeks and hours of research, footage collection, supplementary reading, and of course, painstaking thought and construction. Making a living off of just YouTube revenue can be scary and unreliable, especially with copyright blocks always looming. So if you'd consider helping me in making this channel a stable reality so that in turn I can keep making content you like, I'd appreciate that so much. Now just your view is doing this, so thank you a lot for just that. But if you'd consider supporting me more directly, then there are two great ways to do so. Firstly, there is Patreon, which is where you can pledge a monthly amount, and in exchange, I offer my patrons various different rewards based on their support level. Recently, I had a group call with some of my patrons, and we actually discussed this video at length while I was working on it. It was amazing being able to talk and exchange ideas with them on Avatar: The Last Airbender, and they actually gave me some great insights, so shout out to Nenananas and Mischievous Leaf for that. That's just one of many benefits that patrons get if you'd like to sign up. If you prefer instead just a one-time donation, then a link to PayPal is in the video description. Otherwise, please keep watching my content, and why not join the Soak Discord server where you can come and chat with other like-minded media lovers about your favorite shows or even get new recommendations for stuff to watch. Okay, now back to the video. The next piece of layer cake that we need to add on top to understand Toph is her relationship with gender. And the best place to start is with who Toph was supposed to be. For those who don't know, Toph was originally written as a jock-style, loudmouthed, 16-year-old beefy boy. Despite initial reservation from the show's co-creator Brian Konietzko, they eventually decided to change this to make Toph the character she is in the show. We live in an era where the idea of the girl boss or just a strong female character is something that is hotly debated. Now, some people just have a problem with women on screen in prominent roles. But even putting those weirdos aside, it's undeniable that major film and TV companies often struggle to write authentic female characters. Quite often, it feels really insincere, like some boomer studio executive has designed the character based off of focus group tested checklists. But I think Toph and her origin story shows the value of just writing a human being first and then adding depth to them later. It's obvious that the writers just made a cool character, and then later when they changed Toph's gender, they didn't let that affect who she is as a person, and the result is a female character who feels both badass and real. Now ultimately, it's not my place to decide how female characters should be written, but I've spoken to many women who say that Toph feels so real to them and reflects a version of their own personality, whether that's just in the similarities they see or in the things that they wish they could emulate themselves. In the episode where the gang go to watch the Ember Island theater version of their lives, there's actually an in-joke which references Toph's origins. While most of the gang are unhappy with their portrayals on stage, Toph tells them that the play is spot on and hilarious. Of course, when it's time for her to appear, out steps a big, muscular, gruff dude. Now Katara begins to try and tease Toph about this, reminding her that this play is an accurate reflection of reality, only for Toph to say, "Are you kidding me? I wouldn't have cast it any other way." As hilarious as that exchange is though, it's also a good spot to begin our discussion on Toph's relationship with gender. One of the most interesting things about Toph is that she seems to not let any expectations of what a woman is, or what a woman like her should do, ever affect her. The Ember Island incident is a great example. Toph views herself as strong and fierce. That is her self-identity. So when the play casts her as a strong, tough person, does she care that that's a dude? No. She's just delighted that the attributes she finds valuable are accurately reflected on stage. It doesn't shake her gender identity that it's a man they chose to reflect that. Similarly, she doesn't let expectations of how a lady should look or behave affect how she displays her authentic self. In the first episode we see of her after she's joined the gang, Aang and Sokka are fooling around with Appa's fur, which he's been shedding profusely. Katara in response says, "I'm just glad we finally have another girl in the group because you two are disgusting." This is the exact moment that Toph arrives on the scene to say, "Does anyone have a razor? Because I've got some hairy pits." And this joke even makes Katara laugh. It shows clearly how the gender expectation that as a girl she should be dainty and pristine and clean at all times does not bother Toph at all. She does her own thing. Now this is not to say that Toph is cool for rejecting traditional femininity and Katara is lame for embracing it. In fact, I think this is a great representation of the diversity of human behavior and why the way someone expresses their gender identity should not be enforced on them. Toph and Katara are both women and they are both valid in how they express themselves. The show in fact often uses Katara as a pair with Toph, especially when it's highlighting Toph's behavior. In that Book 3 episode, The Runaway, Katara and Toph clash over various things and the gender undertones are clear. Katara accuses Toph of being irresponsible and reckless, while Toph accuses her of being boring, uptight, and too motherly.
What do you think, Aang? Do I act like a mom?
Well,
Stop rubbing your eye and speak clearly when you talk.
Yes, ma'am.
What we're seeing in many ways are actually two major stereotypes that society puts upon women, personified in Toph and Katara. Katara is the woman as a mother, forced at an early age to give up her own childhood in order to take on a caregiving role in her family. Even now, society is often critical of women who don't choose to assume the role of mother, accusing them of somehow being unwomanly. Toph, on the other hand, represents the woman as a trophy, owned as a piece of property by her father in particular, who completely suppresses her personality so that she can be a delicate little doll for him to present only at the finest banquets and such. In this role, women are given no agency and simply seen as the property of their fathers until they become the property of their husbands. And Toph, of course, has rebelled against all of that, and so now she resents all authority. Now, I spoke in my last video deep diving into Uncle Iroh about how there's a tendency to read too much into fiction and attribute things to it that weren't there. So someone might say, did the two men who created this show really put this much thought into the gender dynamics of their two female characters, one of whom wasn't even supposed to be a woman originally? And I think that's fair and truthfully, probably accurate. Hopefully I'm not doing them any disservice, but they probably didn't think this granularly about how this scene would reflect gender identity. I think this is where two things explain what we're seeing: great writing and the subconscious reflection of society. I think all the writers and creators involved with the show made a great piece of work, and great pieces of media create characters that feel real. And in doing so, writers will reflect things that they see in real life, whether they do that consciously or subconsciously. What we're seeing is an understanding of people, and when people interact, their backgrounds interact with them. Which is why I also need to say that this exchange can't purely be understood in gender terms. Going back to the theme of this video of intersectionality, it's not just that Toph and Katara are two versions of womanhood clashing, but so many other things too. There's class issues here, firstly. Toph is a privileged rich kid who, despite the obvious issues her parents gave her, also never had to face consequences for her actions or think about things like responsibility. Katara, meanwhile, had the complete opposite experience, growing up poor and constantly having to worry about how her actions affect the people around her. And as we discussed, Katara was assigned the role of caretaker. So gender aside, she feels like she has to keep everyone safe and at times police their behavior. She was also raised in a communal society where the whole village is treated as one big family, meaning you're going to be extra conscious about how your individual behavior affects the whole. Toph, meanwhile, wants to live her life with complete and utter independence. There's also a bending aspect to this. A theme throughout The Last Airbender is how the nation and bending style that is native to someone strongly affects their outlook and philosophy on life. Toph is strong-willed and stubborn, like most earthbenders we see. The idea of digging your heels in is quite literally built into earthbending. Katara, meanwhile, is more delicate and graceful, as waterbenders tend to be. Where earthbending feels more like a physical battle, waterbending resembles something more akin to dance. And that obviously affects how we perceive their appearances and gender. If you want some more examples of the show pairing Katara and Toph on screen, you can look at Book 3 Chapter 2, where the gang procure themselves some Fire Nation clothes. One by one, we see them reveal their new outfits, and after Aang's new look, we get Toph's, where she readjusts her shoes so that she can still see. Immediately after her though, we get Katara in a classic "how do I look" moment, where there's a little bit of male gaze going on in the reveal of her more sexy outfit that Aang approves of. It may be subconscious, but it's not accidental that the show compares the traditionally unfeminine look of Toph with the feminine figure of Katara. There's a similar moment in Book 2 Chapter 14 as the girls prepare to infiltrate the Earth King's party, and when the door slides open, we see dolled up Katara and Toph, followed by Aang again blushing at how beautiful Katara looks. In fact, this episode itself is a good illustration of Toph's complexity and duality. When Katara comes up with the plan to sneak into the party, it's Toph who initially shoots it down. "Won't work," she says. "No offense to you simple country folk, but a real society crowd would spot you a mile away. You have no manners." Of course, when Katara gets offended by that categorization and points a finger back at Toph, Toph's answer is really telling, where she burps out loud and then says, "I learned proper society behavior and chose to leave it. You never learned anything." Toph's behavior doesn't come from an inability to be a demure lady, it came from a dislike of behaving that way. It's not that she tried and failed to fit into high society and is only capable of living like a brute. Toph can absolutely turn it on when she wants to. And of course, she demonstrates that moments later by looking and behaving like a proper society girl. Interestingly, in another testament to her duality, she tries to flash the Beifong seal at the guard in order to get entry, only to be shut down. Just 2 episodes before this same trick is successful for her when they're talking to the immigration lady, who is very much wowed by the symbol of the Beifong family. Again, Toph is not abandoning her family and forsaking her name like some characters do in other works of fiction. She's willing to use it when necessary, much like, again, her blindness, which she plays on moments later to get the rest of the gang a ticket to Ba Sing Se by saying, "As you can see, I am blind and these 3 imbeciles are my valets." Complexity and intersectionality. Like I said, it all feeds into one another. But going back to Toph's femininity, no analysis of that would be complete without talking about the most prominent discussion of it in the show, Toph and Katara's story in Tales of Ba Sing Se. Again, as I've already flagged, the two of them are often paired, especially when it comes to matters of womanhood. In this mini-sode, we see everyone's morning routines, and most of Team Avatar is pretty well put together and diligent, even Momo. But then we get Toph looking messy, unkempt, and unbothered. This prompts Katara to suggest that the two go on a girls' day out. They arrive at the Fancy Lady Day Spa, which Toph sarcastically says, "Sounds like my kind of place." But while it's clear that Toph isn't thrilled about this, she also doesn't actually refuse. We've seen in other episodes that when Toph doesn't want to do something, she is not someone you can easily budge. But I think here she's just skeptical more than anything that a traditionally girly day out is what she needs. But she agrees, and when Katara asks if she's ready for some serious pampering, Toph replies, "Sure, whatever you say, as long as they don't touch my feet." Of course, that's the first thing they do, and Toph understandably reacts badly. I mean, for Toph, this is the equivalent of someone scraping your eyeballs. But as their day in the spa progresses, you can see that Toph is having more and more fun as she goofs around with this mud mask and then basks in a relaxing sauna. When they're finally done, Toph says, "Well, that wasn't so bad. I'm not usually into that stuff, but I actually feel girly." That's important to unpack before we go further, I think. Toph isn't someone who views girliness as inherently bad. She's not the kind of character that's like, "Ew, icky girl stuff." She just doesn't relate to traditional ideas of femininity like makeup and pedicures and spa days. But like most of us, her gender identity isn't rigid. It's fluid. Some days we feel inclined one way, sometimes another way. Today, she's able to feel girly alongside Katara. Unfortunately, as they're walking down the street, they're met with a Mean Girls-esque scenario that challenges their identities. A group of girls walking by say, "Wow, great makeup," to which Toph innocently replies, "Thanks," not recognizing the sarcasm. Which is when the girl follows up with, "For a clown," and they all laugh. We see then this heartbreaking shot of how it does bother Toph, even though she will pretend in a minute that it doesn't. Katara tells her to not listen to them, but then the girls continue on, hurling more insults at Toph. Again, we see it weighing heavy on our champion, who then pulls out a move that feels very Toph-like. She turns around and pretends to laugh with them, saying, "You know what else is a good one?" before earthbending a hole underneath the girls, and then Katara joins in on the action by waterbending them down the stream. But as the joke subsides, we get a more earnest moment. Katara catches up with Toph and says, "Those girls don't know what they're talking about." Toph, who is audibly downbeat, replies, "It's okay. One of the good things about being blind is that I don't have to waste my time worrying about appearances. I don't care what I look like. I'm not looking for anyone's approval. I know who I am." Then tears trickle down her face, showing us that it does weigh heavy on her. I think this is a beautiful and really human moment. Society puts this expectation more harshly on women, but I think we can all relate to this feeling that Toph is going through. Rationally, we understand that we shouldn't care what other people think. And yet, from an evolutionary perspective, we've evolved to very much care what our tribe thinks of us. It's how we formed the communities that made humanity such a resilient species. We can't help but care what people around us think about us. And this is all doubly true when it comes to our appearance. We may understand in our heads that it's what's inside that matters, but we all want to be seen as desirable. Sure, being smart or capable or a kind person is important, but we want to be appreciated and still be seen as physically attractive. That's human instinct. So I think this is a really beautiful expression of that from Toph. That even though she rationally understands being blind means she's relieved of the burden of having to care about appearances, or even as a human being, she should be above such things. But ultimately, she does care, like we all do. It does hurt when you feel like you're not beautiful. And I don't think being able to see would change this feeling either. Even if Toph could see her own image and feel like she's objectively pretty, it still doesn't shake those doubts. Which is why I really love what Katara says next. "That's what I really admire about you, Toph. You're so strong and confident and self-assured, and I know it doesn't matter, but you're really pretty." I love that Katara doesn't let Toph's tears and clear self-doubt change the fact that she does view Toph as fundamentally strong, confident, and self-assured. Because that's reality. Even the most confident and self-assured person is still filled with doubt. You would have to be actually delusional to not ever doubt yourself, no matter how highly you rate your looks or your ability. And so, even if Toph is having a bad day or a bad moment, that doesn't change the fact that she is strong. Strength should not be confused with perfection. Toph, visibly emboldened by Katara's words, replies, "I am?" And Katara simply replies, "Yes, you are." Then we see Toph blushing a little with happiness, followed by the two walking down the street, and then we see what I'll call Toph displaying her love language, punching someone. That's not a joke. Anytime Toph feels affection for someone in the show, she shows it by punching them. Some people use gifts, some people use words of affirmation. Toph uses a vicious punch to the upper arm. Now, there are a few instances where The Last Airbender is problematic with its relationship between Toph and gender, namely in how she uses the accusation of girliness to try and insult and emasculate male characters. Most prominently, she does this with Aang. After all, her nickname for him, Twinkle Toes, is a clear attempt to do so. Now, some might say that she's simply describing his light movements, but even when he first appears to fight her on stage, she says, "Do people really want to see two little girls fighting out here?" When they're watching the Ember Island players, Toph, upon rejoicing at her casting as a buff dude, adds, "At least it's not a flying bald lady." And later, when Aang expresses his sadness over being cast as a woman, she tells him he's more in touch with his feminine side than most men, and implies the casting is accurate. It's not exclusive to Aang though. When she's kidnapped by the goons that her parents sent, she interrupts their conversation by saying, "Hey, can you two old ladies quit your bickering for a minute? I gotta go to the bathroom." Now, throughout this video essay, I've given the writers of the show a lot of credit for writing amazing and profound characters who are often progressive far beyond what you can expect from a show in the 2000s, and to be honest, even today. But this is one area where the show definitely dates itself. As someone who lived through that time and watched ATLA as it first aired, this was considered a pretty standard and inoffensive joke at the time, especially from more badass female characters. It's an attempt at seeming empowering that Toph can call someone else, like Aang, a little girl, in order to show that she is more manly than he is. Which of course, the male character is supposed to view as an insult. But of course, questioning Aang's masculinity like this, simply because he doesn't display the characteristics of a fake macho alpha male, is just as toxic as those women who try to attack Toph for not matching their rigid views of femininity. Aang is actually a great example of how being kind and compassionate is a great strength that we should celebrate more in men. So it's not to excuse the show's regressive messaging here, but I also think it's unfair to hold it to a standard of what we'd expect 20 years in the future. We can chalk this down to another notch in the complexity belt, adding another layer of contradictoriness to Toph. But for the next section, I'm going to simplify things a lot, because we're going to talk about how straightforwardly badass Toph is. Probably my favorite line from Toph in the show comes from Book 2, Chapter 9, when Toph first starts training Aang in earthbending. After a struggle to get him into the philosophy of an earthbender, she finally watches as Aang confronts a saber-toothed moose lion head-on and wins. And when he finally snaps at Toph and demands his staff back, she gives him this line: "You just stood your ground against a crazy beast, and even more impressive, you just stood your ground against me." Now, I'm not sure those are two different things, because Toph is a crazy beast herself, but this line I think really well encapsulates her. She's funny, she's supremely confident, and she is, in my mind, the strongest bender in the show. She's basically the undisputed best bender of her own element in the world, certainly better than any other earthbender we see. Maybe Boomy runs her close, but I think he'd concede to Toph on this one too. And if that's not enough, she does something completely unique in the show, invent her own form of bending. You could argue that we meet Hama, who invents bloodbending, if you class this as a new form, but I personally don't. One, water and blood feel more similar to me than metal and earth, but perhaps more importantly, bloodbending is only a thing she and Katara can do under the full moon, when their powers are at their most heightened. Toph learns to metalbend on her own in a short period of time, and can do it anytime, anywhere. Toph is also just genuinely hilarious, especially when it comes to roasting her friends, and particularly Sokka. For example, when Sokka wants to buy a messenger hawk, he says if he got one, he could just send messages and he'd never have to talk to anyone again. Toph savagely replies, "I gotta say, I like the idea of not talking to you." Of course, because she's tough and snarky, there's a danger that a character like that becomes too mean-spirited, or a bit too screw your feelings type. If you consider how she trains Aang, for example, she's pretty brutal and unreceptive to the idea of positive feedback and gentle mentoring. But Toph is actually really sweet and open-minded as well, especially when it comes to adorable old Book 3 Zuko.
Hello, Zuko here.
When he first arrives, everyone on Team Avatar is against him joining. Everyone except Toph. Toph is the only one willing to empathize with Zuko's position, And when they all suggest he was lying and putting on an act of being apologetic, she says, he wasn't lying. I'm just saying, considering his messed up family and how he was raised, he could have turned out a lot worse. Of course, when the gang still refuse, she's the one who goes to meet Zuko herself. Even if that particular encounter ends badly, it shows how Toph does really have an empathetic side to her. Later, after watching the Ember Island play, Zuko is feeling down and honestly ashamed about how he treated his uncle. It's Toph who comforts him by telling him that she had a long chat with his uncle and knows that he'd be proud of how Zuko has redeemed himself and found the right path in the end. Visibly, you can see how cute and cheered up Zuko looks before Toph hits him with the trademark fist to the arm, and when he asks, "What was that for?" she simply replies, "That's how I show affection," which we've already established. I think this is ultimately what makes Toph such a likable character in The Last Airbender, because she is both tough as nails and yet often soft and warm and adorable. She's funny and roasty at times, but also knows when to provide comfort to her friends. And like a real person, she is many things at the same time. And okay, I confess, I lied earlier. My actual favorite Toph line isn't really so much of a self-contained funny quote, but actually Toph at her most raw and sweet and vulnerable. In Book 3, Chapter 6, after finding out about Avatar Roku's relationship with Fire Lord Sozin, Aang tells the gang that the lesson of the story was that everyone has good and evil in them. He says the story was about friendship. Toph, looking a bit pensive and worried, asks, "Do you really think friendships can last more than one lifetime?" Now, in the world of Avatar, this is something that is physically possible. But I'm going to choose to interpret her words a little more metaphorically, if you'd allow me. Toph is a fictional character, of course, so a lifetime for her is whatever the writers decide to make it. But another way to look at it is that the show itself is Toph's lifetime. And with each rewatch, we are rediscovering another lifetime. Another chance to get to know these beloved characters all over again in a new light. Discovering something fresh, realizing something you didn't realize before. So, to Toph, thank you for a friendship that has lasted several lifetimes. And each time I join her and the rest of the gang, I'm so grateful to find something new to fall in love with every time. Thank you for watching this video. If you've made it this far, then, well, now I officially consider you a fan of this channel. So I hope you'll 1. Be liking and subscribing, 2. Joining our Discord server to hang with the lovely community we have, 3. Watching the other videos on the Soak channel, and 4. I hope you'll consider supporting me directly via Patreon or PayPal, if you can, of course. The links to everything is in the video description, and that last one is very much optional. Please do let me know in the comments what you'd like to see me cover next. Shows, films, anime. I'm very open and I love hearing your ideas and suggestions. And thank you as always for watching, spending your precious time here, and allowing me to keep on living this dream. And I hope to see you again very, very soon. Have a great day.